The sky over Chicago on the evening of January 23, 1963, held no warning. It was the color of old pewter, low and featureless, the kind of winter overcast that settles in off Lake Michigan and stays for days. Along State Street, the streetcars hummed their familiar electric whine, steel wheels clicking over frozen rails, sparks occasionally snapping from the overhead wires into the damp air. The wind coming off the lake carried a fine mist, not quite rain, not quite snow, just a cold wetness that touched your face and disappeared. Between the buildings, the smell of coal heat drifted down from 1,000 furnaces, mixing with exhaust from idling Chevrolets and Fords lined up at traffic lights. People walked home from work with their collars turned up, hands deep in coat pockets, breath visible in the streetlight glow. The temperature hovered right at 32 degrees. No one thought much about it. Winter in Chicago meant cold. It meant snow. It meant bundling up and getting on with things. But what was beginning to fall from that gray sky was something else entirely, something the city had not prepared for and would not soon forget. The first droplets were invisible against the darkening afternoon. They touched the pavement and vanished into a thin glaze. They landed on car hoods and spread into sheets of perfect transparency. On the trolley wires overhead, each drop froze the instant it made contact, building microscopic layers that would, over the coming hours, grow into something catastrophic. By 6 o'clock, the windows of storefronts along Michigan Avenue had begun to fog from the inside, then frost over in delicate patterns. But outside, the glass was developing a different coating altogether, smooth and clear and harder than it should have been. A man waiting at a bus stop on Wabash Avenue reached out to steady himself against a lamppost and found his glove sticking slightly to the metal. He pulled away, confused. The post gleamed under the streetlight as if it had been dipped in varnish. Across the city, a strange and silent transformation had begun. Freezing rain is not snow. Snow is forgiving. It piles up, insulates, can be shoveled and plowed and melted with salt. Freezing rain is water that remains liquid as it falls through subfreezing air, only solidifying when it strikes a surface colder than 32 degrees. Every object becomes a canvas for ice. Every surface, a platform for accumulation. In 1963, Chicago's infrastructure was old. The power lines strung between wooden poles had been there since before the war. The elevated train tracks were maintained, but never designed to bear the weight of a heavy ice load. The streets were narrow in many neighborhoods, lined with trees planted decades earlier, their branches now stretching over sidewalks and power lines alike. And on this particular January night, the temperature was sitting in that narrow, dangerous band where freezing rain thrives. Not cold enough to turn the precipitation to snow, not warm enough to keep it liquid. Just cold enough to turn an entire city into glass. By 7 o'clock, the rain was falling steadily. It made almost no sound. There was no patter on rooftops, no splash in gutters. Just a soft, continuous whisper as millions of droplets coated every exposed surface. On the north side, a Chicago Transit Authority motorman named Ed Kowalski was bringing his streetcar down Milwaukee Avenue when he felt the wheels begin to slip. He eased off the throttle, but the car continued to glide forward, slower now, the steel wheels losing their grip on rails that had become skating rinks. He applied the brake. The car slid another 20 feet before stopping. He tried to accelerate again. The wheels spun uselessly, whining against the ice. Behind him, passengers swayed and muttered. Kowalski stepped down from the cab and walked to the front of the car, his boots crunching on what should have been wet pavement but was now a solid sheet of ice. The rails gleamed under the streetlights, coated in a layer so smooth and clear he could see the grain of the steel beneath. He touched it with his glove. It was like touching a window. He looked up. The overhead wires were encased in ice, each strand twice its normal thickness, sagging slightly under the weight. He had been driving streetcars in Chicago for 19 years. He had never seen anything like this. All across the city, the same scene was repeating. Cars lost traction on the slightest incline and slid backward into intersections. Taxis crept along at walking speed, drivers gripping their steering wheels with both hands, trying to navigate streets that had become ice rinks. On the Dan Ryan Expressway, a truck jackknifed and blocked 3 lanes. Behind it, cars piled up slowly, drivers stepping out to find their vehicles encased in shells of ice so thick they couldn't open the doors from the outside. On the south side, a woman named Dorothy Harmon tried to leave her apartment building on Drexel Boulevard and found the front door frozen shut. The ice had sealed the gap between the door and the frame, bonding them together. She pushed. Nothing. She called to her husband. Together they shouldered the door, and it finally cracked open with a sound like breaking glass, shards of ice falling onto the vestibule floor. Outside, the steps were slick and treacherous. Dorothy held the railing and felt it shift under her hand. She looked closer. The railing was coated in ice so thick it had become a smooth, rounded bar, and the bolts holding it to the brick were pulling loose under the added weight. She went back inside and decided to stay. The trees were the first to fail. Along residential streets throughout the city, branches that had stood for decades began to crack under the accumulating weight. Each twig, each limb was gaining mass by the minute as the freezing rain continued to fall. An elm tree on Damon Avenue split down the middle with a sound like a rifle shot, half of it crashing onto a parked Buick, the other half falling across the sidewalk. A maple on Lincoln Avenue lost 3 major branches in succession, each one groaning and snapping and thundering to the ground, taking power lines with them. In Grant Park near the lake, the trees were bowing under the load, their branches sweeping low toward the frozen grass, encased in ice so thick they looked like crystal sculptures. A photographer named Michael Shea, on assignment for the Tribune, walked through the park that night with his camera, capturing images of a city transformed. He described it later as surreal, otherworldly. The streetlights refracted through the ice on every surface, creating halos and rainbows. The trees glittered. The benches looked like they had been carved from diamond. And everywhere the creaking, the low, continuous groan of wood and metal and ice under strain. The power lines began to fall around 8:30. On the west side, a transformer on a wooden pole near Ashland Avenue exploded in a shower of sparks, the pole itself snapping in half under the weight of the ice-laden wires. The lights went out in a 6-block radius. 10 minutes later, another pole failed on the north side, then another on the south side. The utility company Commonwealth Edison began receiving calls by the hundreds. Lines down, power out, streets dark. Crews were dispatched, but the trucks couldn't navigate the iced-over roads. Linemen who managed to reach the failure sites found themselves working in conditions they had never trained for. The poles were slick with ice. The wires were encased in sheaths of frozen water several inches thick, making them 3 or 4 times their normal weight. A lineman named Frank Durkin, working near Pulaski Road, described climbing a pole and finding the wood itself coated in ice, his spikes barely finding purchase. At the top, the wires hung in heavy loops, sagging dangerously low, sparking where they touched tree branches or metal fences. He radioed down to his crew. They needed more men, more equipment, more time, but the storm was not giving them time. By 10 o'clock, entire neighborhoods were dark. The ice was now several centimeters thick on most surfaces. Car windows were opaque with it. Fire hydrants looked like ice sculptures. Mailboxes were frozen shut. The elevated train lines, which ran above street level on steel trestles, were coated in ice that added tons of weight to structures never designed to bear it. A train operator on the loop reported feeling the tracks shift beneath his car as he rounded a curve near Wabash and Van Buren. He slowed to a crawl, then stopped altogether, unwilling to risk a derailment. Behind him, the line backed up. Passengers sat in darkened cars, the lights flickering as the third rail struggled to deliver power through ice-coated contacts. Some trains lost power completely and had to be evacuated, passengers climbing down metal stairs onto icy platforms, holding the railings with both hands, moving one careful step at a time. The silence was what people remembered most. In a city of 3.5 million, a city that never truly slept, the night of January 23, 1963 was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Traffic had stopped. The streetcars were stalled. The trains were halted. Even the wind off the lake seemed to pause. What remained was the sound of ice, the creak of tree branches bending, the crack of limbs breaking, the tinkle of icicles falling from eaves and shattering on the pavement below. And occasionally, the deep, resonant boom of a power pole collapsing, followed by the cascade of sparks and the descending whine of wires hitting the ground. People stayed inside, watching through frosted windows as their world became something alien and beautiful and dangerous. In the early hours of the morning, the freezing rain finally stopped. The temperature had dropped just enough to turn the precipitation to snow, and then the clouds moved on, leaving behind a sky that cleared to reveal stars. The city lay still beneath them, encased in ice. At dawn, the sun rose over Lake Michigan and struck a landscape transformed. Every building, every tree, every car and lamppost and fence was sheathed in crystal. The light refracted through the ice, breaking into spectrums, casting rainbows onto the snow-dusted streets. Icicles hung from the eaves of skyscrapers, some of them 10 feet long, glittering like chandeliers. Along the lakefront, the waves that had crashed against the breakwater had frozen mid-motion, creating sculptures of ice that rose and curled and hung suspended, as if time itself had stopped. People began to emerge slowly, carefully. They opened their doors and stepped onto porches slick with ice. They looked up at trees that had split and fallen, at power lines draped across streets, at cars buried under collapsed branches. On Diversey Parkway, a man tried to open his car door and couldn't. The ice had sealed it shut. He went back inside for a pot of warm water, poured it over the handle, and managed to pry it open, only to find the windshield coated in ice so thick he couldn't see through it. He chipped at it with a scraper for 20 minutes before giving up and going back inside. Across the city, similar scenes played out. Businesses remained closed. Schools were canceled. The few people who ventured out walked with shuffling, cautious steps, arms out for balance, moving like they were crossing a frozen pond in the middle of winter. The cleanup took days. Commonwealth Edison worked around the clock, replacing hundreds of downed poles and thousands of feet of wire. City crews sanded the streets, though the sand was almost useless on ice this thick. The sun did more work than any machine, gradually melting the glaze over the course of a week. As the ice receded, the damage became clear. Thousands of trees had lost major branches or split completely. Entire blocks had been without power for 2 or 3 days. Roofs had collapsed under the weight of the ice. Cars had been crushed by falling limbs. And yet, remarkably, only a handful of injuries were reported, and no deaths directly attributed to the storm. Chicago, a city that prided itself on toughness and resilience, had been brought to a standstill by something as simple as rain that froze. In the weeks that followed, the city made changes. Utility companies began reinforcing poles and burying lines where feasible. The Transit Authority updated its protocols for ice events. Weather forecasters paid closer attention to that narrow temperature band where freezing rain becomes likely. But the people who lived through that night carried it with them. They remembered the eerie beauty of a city turned to glass, the way the streetlights glowed through the ice, the sound of branches snapping in the dark, the silence that settled over neighborhoods usually filled with noise. They remembered stepping outside at dawn and seeing their world remade, glittering and fragile and impossibly beautiful. The 1963 Chicago ice storm was not the deadliest weather event the city had ever faced. It was not the coldest or the snowiest or the windiest, but it was, in its own way, the most transformative. For one long night, a metropolis of steel and stone and concrete became something else entirely. A sculpture, a work of art made by accident, by the precise alignment of temperature and moisture and time. The streetcars and the power lines and the everyday machinery of urban life, all of it rendered useless by a coating of frozen water just a few centimeters thick. It was a reminder, quiet but profound, of the power of nature to reshape the world we build, to turn the familiar into the extraordinary, to make us see, if only for a moment, the beauty and the fragility of the place we call home. And when the ice finally melted, when the streets were cleared and the power restored and the broken branches hauled away, the city returned to itself. The streetcars hummed along their tracks. The elevated trains clattered overhead. The wind off Lake Michigan carried its familiar cold. But those who had been there that night, who had walked through a city made of glass, never quite saw Chicago the same way again. They knew now what could happen when the temperature held at exactly the wrong degree, when the rain fell and froze and kept falling. They knew that a city, for all its strength and noise and permanence, could be silenced in a single evening, could be made to glitter, could be turned, for just a few hours, into something as delicate and fleeting as a dream.